Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and another video. Today I'm going to show you step by step how to paint this realistic tiger in ink. So I'll be going through all the different techniques I use to paint blurry backgrounds, crisp white whiskers and thick stripy animal fur. And if you want to try this one out for yourself, I'll also put a link in the top of the description box below where you can download the outline sketch for free. So I hope you enjoy it. All the materials I've used, as well as the reference photo, will also be listed down below, but you can use whatever medium or supplies you have. And if you do have a go, don't forget to tag me in on Instagram at Sarah Newbury Art with your tigers, as I'd love to see them. Okay, so before I start, let's quickly go through the steps for this painting, as it's a bit of a long one. The first step is to mask out around the tiger and the whiskers. Then we're going to paint the background, followed by the eyes and the nose. Once dry, step 4 is to remove the masking fluid from around the tiger's outline. Step 5 is to paint in the ears and the darkest stripes on the face and body. For step 6, we're going to paint the midtones. Step 7 is to remove the remaining masking fluid from the whiskers. And finally, step 8 is to finish off and put in those final details. Okay, so as you can see, I've transferred my tiger outline sketch onto my Arches watercolour paper and taped around it first with Scotch Magic Tape for a nice crisp border, and then with painter's tape or frog tape to secure it to the board and stop it from warping or buckling. Step 1 then is to mask out all around the outside of the tiger so I can paint the background quickly without having to fuss about painting around individual hairs. I'm using this masking fluid pen by Pebeo, but use whatever masking fluid you have. I use a continuous line around the body and ears and individual fur strokes around both sides of the face, as I want these to really show up nice and white against the background at the end. I make sure to use my reference photo for the length and direction of the fur here, but don't worry about copying it exactly. I also mask out some of the white fur detail on the inside of the tiger's ears. The fur is longer here, so remember to change the length of your brush marks to match. Finally, I mask out the whiskers and the highlights in the eyes and any other details where I want to preserve the white of the paper. This masking fluid is light blue, so you can see where I've used it. Once the masking fluid is dry, we can move on to step 2, which is to paint the background, and for this I'm going to be using the wet on wet technique to get a blurry out of focus look. The ink I'm using today is Dr. P.H. Martin's India Ink, and I'm just putting a few drops of that onto an old palette and diluting it down a bit with a few drops of clean water. It's handy to have an off-cut or spare piece of watercolour paper to hand to swatch out the ink and make sure it's the tone you want before applying it to your painting. I wanted it a bit darker, as it will be diluted when I apply it to wet paper anyway, so I just added a few more drops of ink. With that done, I pre-wet the background with clean water using a size 12 round brush. I make sure my paper is evenly wet all over and has a nice sheen to it without being too wet. Too wet and you'll get puddles and an uneven wash as the ink dries. Too little water and your paper will dry too quickly and the ink won't be able to flow smoothly over the surface of the paper. This is an A3 size sheet of Arches cotton paper, so I added a few layers of water so it didn't dry before I'd finished painting. Then I took the same size 12 brush and began to loosely drop in ink, letting it bleed over the surface of the wet paper. I wasn't going for an even flat wash, so it was okay that some parts were darker than others, and helped it to look a bit more natural. Masking out the fur and whiskers made this step a lot quicker and easier to do. I also left some areas free of ink, like in the top right hand corner, just to give the impression that light was coming through here. Now that's all dry, it's time for step 3, which is to paint in the eyes and nose. I'm going to use a dip pen for this and my small screw cap bottle of ink, as it's easier to use with the dip pen, but if you don't have a dip pen, you can always use a small pointed paintbrush or even a permanent fine liner. It's up to you. I start by carefully outlining the darkest parts of the eyes and nose, so around the outside of the iris and eyelids, and around the nostrils. I really like painting in the eyes and facial features early on in any animal painting, as it really helps to give them character right from the start. But you don't have to do it this way round if you don't want to. Do whatever works best for you. With that dry, I'm now going in with a smaller round paintbrush to paint in the irises of the eyes. This is a size 4 paintbrush, and I'm using the same concentration of ink that I used for the background, only I'm applying it onto dry paper for this first layer. I like to work on both eyes at the same time, as I find it easier than painting one fully and then trying to match the other one up. Whilst this first layer is still damp, I can also drop in more of that diluted ink around the outside of each iris, which helps give the eye shape and form. Next, I paint the bottom eyelid using a slightly darker ink and water mix, and again applying it onto dry paper. I do the same on the other eye, being careful to note any slight variations between the two by checking back with my reference photo. I'm painting the top eyelid now using ink straight out of the bottle, and I leave some of the white of the paper here where there are some white hairs over the eyelid to help it look realistic. For the pupils, I just painted onto dry paper again. They look like two little diamond shapes with a highlight going through the middle. I also noticed some darker shadow above and below the highlight, so once the pupils were dry, I painted this on too, and softened out any hard edges using a clean damp brush. And repeated it on the other eye. It's back to the nose next, and this tiger's nose is pretty light in value, so I used the wet on wet technique again, pre-wetting my paper first before adding in just the tiniest amount of ink. I also darkened up around the nostrils and softened the edges here with a clean damp brush. Whilst the paper is damp, you can also drop in more concentrated ink to the darker part of the nostril and let it bleed out to get a softer, more natural look. For the darker fur above the nose, I just painted onto dry paper. Make sure the ink is dry on the lighter part of the nose if you don't want it to all bleed together. Okay, now that's all dry, it's time for the next step, step 4, which is to remove the masking fluid from the outside of the tiger's fur. I'm leaving the masking fluid on the whiskers and fur inside the ear until later on. It's time for step 5 next, and we're going to paint the ears and the darkest stripes on the tiger's face and body. I like to get in these darkest values early on, as it will make gauging the value I need for the midtones a lot easier. I start by pre-wetting the inside of the ear with clean water using my size 12 brush, being careful to leave a small area around the outside of the ear dry. And now for the fun bit. I take a dip pen, or you can use a small paintbrush, and dip it into neat ink, and then draw around the edge of my waterline. This creates a really dramatic dark line, and the ink bleeds inwards into the ear. It's so fun to watch. You can also pull some of the ink into the dry areas to create some fine fur details, like I'm doing here. Now I'm going in with a smaller round paintbrush. This one is the size 4, and I'm using it to pull some of that ink into the inside of the ear. I load more ink onto my brush and paint the darker part of the ear nearest the head. Then I continue to add further layers using the reference photo as a guide to help me with my values and the length and direction of the fur here. Ink dries a lot lighter than when you first apply it, so I need to go back and apply another layer to get the dark value I want. I paint the second ear in the same way. Now both ears are dry, I can paint the lighter outside edge of each ear, just using a paintbrush onto dry paper. I adjust my values once again around the outside of the ears, painting onto dry paper, and soften out the edges. So now it's time to paint those all-important tiger stripes. And for this I'm using an old small flat paintbrush, which is really going to simplify painting realistic fur and stripes. I did a bit of practice with different techniques on a scrap piece of paper and decided that the dry brush technique worked best, but of course you can use whatever technique suits you. This is just the way I decided to do it. So I dip my brush into the concentrated ink on my palette, sop up any excess water in my brush onto a paper towel, and use the brush in short side-to-side strokes. If you don't have a small flat brush like this, you can use an old round paintbrush and splay out the bristles to get a similar effect. It's a really quick and easy technique and creates not just the black stripes, but the white fur areas on either side too. To make your fur look natural and realistic though, it's really important to make sure you look at the length and direction of fur growth from your reference photo. I started on the fur above the right eye and worked my way out from here, changing the angle and direction of my brush strokes as I moved outwards, and keeping in mind how the fur would wrap around the shape of the face and body. I used my brush right up on the tip for the smaller stripes, and on the edge of the flat brush to help me more accurately follow the direction of fur growth around areas like the eyes. I continue to move down the right side of the face, lengthening my brush strokes as the fur gets longer here. You can see just how dry my brush is, but because it's dry it naturally leaves some gaps where the ink skips over the texture of the paper, and this really helps to add a realistic look to the fur. When painting stripes it can sometimes seem a bit daunting, and you may worry about getting lost or muddled with which stripe you're on, especially if your eyes are flicking backwards and forwards from a reference photo. To try and simplify the process, I lightly hatched across the dark stripes when I first drew out my outline sketch, and I thought this might help you too if you want to download the outline and try it out for yourself. Once I'd finished on the right side of the tiger's face, I carried on to the left-hand side, again matching my brush strokes to the length of fur and painting in the direction of fur growth. With an almost dry brush, the ink dries quickly, so you can also add layers of fur as you go to build depth and give the impression of a full and thick tiger's coat. I've slowed the video right down here so you can better see what I mean. I've got some ink on my brush and I'm angling my brush to match the direction of fur growth. I use light flicking strokes to get tapered ends to the fur. I don't paint all the fur exactly the same either. Just like in nature, there would be some black hairs in the white fur and some white hairs in the black fur. And by adding this variation, not only are you painting the black stripes, you're also painting the white ones at the same time. You can make the fur look even thicker by going over with another layer of dry ink too. Once you get into the swing of it, it's not difficult, but it is time consuming, so you might need to take a few breaks before you finish the stripes. Now before we move on to step 6 and paint in the midtones, I just want to loosely paint in the rock in the foreground here. So it's back to my size 12 brush and some more wet on wet painting. I didn't try and copy the reference photo exactly for this part, I just wanted to paint it quite quickly and include a variety of tones and textures, and it made a nice change to the more organised stripes I've been painting. Okay, now that's all completely dry, it's time for step 6, which is to paint in the midtones. So these are any tones between the white of the paper and the darkest darks in the portrait. So here I refer back to my reference photo and try to pick out the lightest and darkest midtones before I start. There are dark tones on the top of the tiger's head and under his face on his body, and some lighter areas that I'll need to keep in mind too, around the outside of the head and the right shoulder. I'm going to use a mixture of different techniques for this, so I start by diluting some ink down and swatching it out. I'm going to use the wet on wet technique again here first to paint a base layer to build all the midtones on. So I pre-wet the tiger's face first before dropping in ink. I like to work in layers with ink, rather like I do with watercolour, to build up these midtones gradually. As once one layer has dried, I can easily re-wet the area again and go darker if I need to. As I said earlier, ink dries a lot lighter, so it's not always easy to judge the midtones right in the first layer. Ink though, unlike watercolour, dries permanent, which can be an advantage as there's no chance of disturbing previous layers once they're dry. But it does also mean that you haven't got the flexibility to lift out any previous layers as well. So best to build up to the tones you want, as you can't go back. With the first light midtone layer drying on the tiger's face, I can now go in and paint a light midtone wash all over the rest of the tiger's body, using my size 12 brush, and remembering to avoid the lightest, brightest parts of the tiger's fur. You can apply this either onto wet paper like I did for the face, or as a glaze onto dry paper. But remember, if you're painting onto dry paper, that to avoid any hard edges or brush marks you might not want, you'll need to soften them out with a clean damp brush. I used the glazing method on the tiger's chest as I didn't want my ink to be further diluted with water in this more shadowed area. But around the lightest fur on the tiger's shoulder, I used the wet on wet technique again, but use whatever method suits you best. Now that's dry, it's back to my flat brush again to paint in some of the darker mid-tone fur details. So I'm using the dry brush method again in the same way as I did for the black stripes, only this time I'm using more diluted ink. I use this layer to add more depth to the forehead, around the eyes and on the nose, before moving on to building a lighter mid-tone layer between the stripes, to help the transition between the black and white areas look more natural and cohesive. On the top of the nose here, I'm also using a stippling action with my brush, so using it right up on the tip and just dabbing in some ink just to add variety and texture. I also use this darker mid-tone to add fur detail and markings around the mouth and chin. Now our tiger is really starting to come together, but we still need to add some even darker midtones to really make it pop. So I've mixed up a darker mixture using slightly more ink and less water this time, and I'm going to brush this in over the longer fur either side of the mouth, and in the darker shadow areas on the tiger's chest. I also darken the fur under the left paw here, where this area is in shadow. And here I'm adding another mid-tone band of fur between the black stripes, still using the dry brush technique. Now with all that dry and looking at my reference photo, I saw that I needed to adjust my values again. This time though, I can use more water on my brush and apply the ink more like a glaze onto the dry paper. Glazes are a great way to quickly and easily change up the value or even the colour when working with transparent mediums. So I applied this darker mid-tone glaze by looking at the painting as a whole instead of as its individual areas, and using my reference photo as a guide. I also spent a bit more time on the tiger's paw at the front here, adding in more fur detail with a dry brush and darker mid-tones to bring it into line with the rest of the painting. Working in layers like this can take time, and sometimes darkening up one area can then mean you have to go back and adjust another area that you were previously happy with, like this stone for example. But getting your values right is so important when painting anything realistically, so it's worth putting in the time. For me, this step took longer than painting all the tiger's stripes, and was part of the reason why, when I posted the finished piece on Instagram last week, I said I wouldn't be making it into a video as I knew it would be a long one. But after giving my eyes a rest, I decided I would. So I would say split up the painting process and give yourself regular breaks, so you can come back to it with fresh eyes and renewed enthusiasm, as I find this really helps and prevents you rushing for the finish line. So with all that said and the painting dry, we are finally ready for step 7, which is to remove the remaining masking fluid, so from inside the ear and of course the whiskers. Our last step, step 8, is to neaten everything up and add any last details and finishing touches. I'm using Dr. P.H. Martin's bleedproof white ink first, and a size 1 liner brush to tidy up some of the white hairs and whiskers. But if you don't have this, you can always use a white gouache, white gel pen, or whatever you have to hand. As a final step, I also like to use a sharp black coloured pencil to help define some of the white hairs, blend in the whiskers so they look more natural and not stuck on, and also add in a few fine hairs just to finish it all off. And with that, this tiger was finished, and I think it turned out okay, even if the ink did manage to squeeze under my tape. But let me know what you think, or if you tried it, and if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up, a share and subscribe, and hit the bell icon to be notified as soon as I upload a new video. Thank you all so much for watching, take care, have a great weekend, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!